Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the February edition of the FTA Brexit webinar on the latest developments on Brexit. So today we have 45 minutes for our broadcast. We are going to cover a variety of topics. First of all, of course, an update on the status of negotiations, because negotiations restarted last week, so there's quite a lot to say in this respect. Then we'll focus on options for a transition or implementation period, as the UK government calls it. The negotiations have finally started on that, so again, quite a lot to say. We will then give you an update, and that will be my colleague Sarah Lawadi from the Brussels office, who will give you an update on the post-Brexit arrangements for road transport, with a specific focus, of course, on the haulage bill. And after that, there will be a bit of an outline of the future FTA events and activities that you need to have in your diary. So before we start properly with the content, I just wanted to remind you of a few house rules. To please keep your microphone and telephone muted. The webinar is being recorded. It will then be available on the FTA website a few days after today. Unfortunately, we are not going to be able to deal with any technical issues that you could experience during the webinar, but obviously you can always go back to the recording. At the end of the webinar, there might be a bit of time for questions. You can use the chat box to ask any questions you have throughout the webinar. Any questions that we're not able to answer on the webinar, we'll try and get back to you. So in terms of the status of negotiations, obviously there was a summit in December where the EU27 heads of state and government agreed that sufficient progress had been made on the withdrawal issues. So these were the issues of the Irish border, of the financial settlement, as well as the citizens' rights, so EU workers. And the talks on transition, as I said earlier, really properly started last week. So they started on Tuesday. It was the first time that the two sides were actually talking to each other on the transition, even though obviously they knew more or less their respective positions, because each side had issued a document or made a speech to this extent. In parallel, I think it's important to mention that there are internal workshops for EU27, which are continuing. So this is organized by the task force of Michel Barnier on various topics. The last time in January, we reported on the aviation one, but you'll have one on road probably next week, we understand. There has been one, I believe, on services as well. And there's been one on international trade, and I understand that there might have been one on customs, although the slides are not available yet. We will report back on all of this as and when the slides become available through the new Brexit Digest. If you are interested in receiving this, it's every Monday afternoon. You just need to drop us an email and we'll be very happy to put you on the list. In terms of the future relationships, so obviously the press reported after the December Council that the discussions have moved on to trade, which is not completely correct, because in fact the discussions on the future relationship have not yet started between the two negotiating teams. They could start at the earliest in spring, and that will only be the case once the EU27 have adopted a set of formal negotiating guidelines that will basically give the mandate to Michel Barnier to start talking about the future. Transport will be part of that, but obviously the fact that the internal workshops the product of these workshops is public, because the slides are then shared with stakeholders. That means that also UK negotiators can have a pretty good idea already of what's the EU27 thinking on some of these issues. Obviously, and this is important to mention, from a purely legal point of view, the only certainty that we have is the one provided by the letter that Theresa May issued on the 29th of March 2017, which is that on the 29th of March 2019 at the latest, the UK will be leaving the EU. All the things that were agreed in December at the moment are just a political agreement. It doesn't mean it's worthless, but it means that it's not yet legally enforceable. So before you start writing to your EU workers and telling them that they will be fine no matter what, it's probably wiser to wait until you have legal assurance that this is going to be the case. So in terms of where we are with the state of play, so we're still in this full phase negotiations. The first 3 phases are supposed to happen before Brexit, the last one are before after. In fact, the withdrawal arrangement sessions, this is still ongoing. So basically, discussions on citizens are pretty much finalized. There are still some pending points, but small ones. Financial settlement, that's finalized as well. Obviously, as long as the UK lives when planned, when expected. But discussions on Ireland are still very much ongoing, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. Transitional measures, so this is the second phase of negotiations, and negotiations, as I said, have just started on that. The transition will be limited in time, so it's not going to last forever, and currently the EU27 wants it to end in December 2020. So this negotiation started on the 6th of February. The framework for the future relationship, as I said, all of these discussions are only going to take place after let's say, an agreement has been found on the transition. So we're expecting probably not before March in any case. And it can only start once the EU27 side have approved a set of guidelines, as I said, which they will do at the earliest on the 22nd and 23rd of March of this year. This is only going to give us the basic bare bones of what the future deal could look like. It will in no way be a complete trade negotiation, and we're not going to know all the arrangements at that point. All of this will come later, post-Brexit. So, as I mentioned, there are still some ongoing issues with the withdrawal agreement. The negotiations are not yet completely finished, so this is still to some degree ongoing. There were various topics that were not even dealt with before December that are now being taken care of, such as what happened to public procurement, what happened to goods that were in transit at the time of Brexit. So all of these issues are still being negotiated, or what happens to IP rights, intellectual property rights, the use of data, and so on. It's fair to say that not all issues have been solved, even on the topics discussed before December. So even when we were told there was an agreement, there are still some significant points of disagreement on some of these details. It's important because the EU27 side don't seem to think that these are unimportant details. And one in particular issue, which is still very much being discussed, is the issue of governance for the withdrawal agreement. What that means is basically the arrangements needed to make sure the withdrawal treaty can be enforced post-Brexit. This is the guarantee that both sides need to make sure that whatever is agreed will be enforced. So, for instance, ensuring that the UK will indeed guarantee the rights of EU workers and vice versa, and ensuring that both sides agree to find good solutions and stick to it for the border in Ireland, for instance. One clear point of disagreement there is the role that the European Court of Justice will play post-Brexit. For instance, as part of the enforcement of citizens' rights, of EU workers' rights. This is an area where obviously there is still a significant degree of disagreement, and it could, of course, put the likelihood of success at risk. The other massive issue which is still on the table is the Irish border. There was a political agreement, however, the Irish border conundrum has not been completely solved. What we have is an agreement on the goals, on where both sides want to go, but no agreement yet on how to do it in practice. Michel Barnier last week in his press conference reminded everyone of 3 options that had been listed in the December joint agreement to avoid a hard border in Ireland, and he explained what these options would be. So the first was to basically solve the issue of the Irish border through the overall relationship between the EU and the UK. This is the preferred option for both sides. However, as Barnier pointed out, the UK government's decision to leave both the single market and the customs union could make border checks unavoidable, meaning that avoiding a hard border on the island of Ireland for this scenario is not, at this point in time, considered very realistic by the EU27 side. The second option is to find specific solutions, focusing solely on the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. Barnier pointed out that these solutions have not been listed, so it's more a theoretical option at this point, and they are very much waiting for the UK government to come up with these solutions. So they don't see it as their role from the EU27 point of view to propose these solutions. So the option they seems to be focusing on at the moment, I don't think they've discarded the other 2 because politically all 3 will have to be discussed somehow in parallel. But the option they seem to be focusing on is the fallback solutions, where the negotiators agreed to preserve the full alignment of Northern Ireland with rules of the single market and customs union that support cooperation for Ireland, the Irish economy, and the Good Friday Agreement. What does that mean in practice? Well, it's widely understood on the EU27 side to mean that the rules in Northern Ireland and in the Republic, so meaning Northern Ireland and the rest of the EU, in fact, would have to be the same. So if any new rules are discussed in Brussels, they'd have to be implemented in Northern Ireland. And that obviously there could be no tariffs or customs obligations of any sort between Northern Ireland and the Republic. The big difficulty is that the UK government doesn't see it completely like that. They believe in mutual recognition of rules rather than full alignment, meaning that they would see the possibility to have potentially different rules that are recognized as being equivalent. And of course, there's another massive conundrum, which is what happens between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. And obviously the UP, who's an ally of the Conservative Party, is very much against any differentiation of Northern Ireland and any hard border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. So this is still an issue which is likely to prove a bit problematic in the future as the negotiators go more into the details. And there's one last point which is really worth remembering, that no transition can be agreed without a withdrawal treaty. So if there's any difficulty, if there's any disagreement, if there's any problem on all of these issues, there will not be a transition period. This is very important to remember, because it means that the risk of a cliff edge is a possible possibility still. So this is where we are with these topics. Before I move to the transition, I wanted to update you briefly on latest developments from the EU27 side. There is a new EU preparedness website where they have published a variety of notes to industry on the impact of no deal. Mentioned a few times the ones on aviation, on road transport, but there are now some on pretty much every topic you could think of, from what happens in terms of food standards and food control to what happens in now has been covered or is being covered. So this is quite an interesting source of information, although of course it focuses on the impact of no deal. We will keep publishing links to these in the weekly newsletter, the Brexit Digest. There have also been a number of internal workshops on trade, on services, on aviation, and as I mentioned, we're expecting one on road next week. Obviously, once the slides become available again, we will share that on the digest. And the other very big development is publication of draft legal provisions on a transition period by the EU27 side. What is that? Well, sorry, to be clear, it's not yet been approved, in fact, by the EU27. It's a proposal from the European Commission, so it could still change that point of view and is expected to change a little bit. What are these legal provisions for, and where will it fit in the wider negotiations? Well, these are articles that will be integrated in the withdrawal treaty, and this withdrawal treaty is the agreement, essentially, that will have to be ratified before Brexit, which will touch upon the issue of the Irish border, the issue of the EU workers' rights and UK workers' rights, as well as financial settlement, public procurement, and all the ongoing procedures or ongoing movements when Brexit happens. The transition will be part of that, and therefore it requires a legal text to define it and to set it in stone as it is. In terms of the priorities, so as I said, the EU27 side adopted negotiating directives on the 29th of January. The draft text I was just talking about is basically based on this. It's the European Commission's technical answer to the political red line and negotiating mandate given by the EU27 side at the end of January. What it says is that there will be a transition period that will run until the end of December 2020, assuming, of course, the withdrawal treaty gets ratified. And there are a number of conditions that are attached to that. So if you look at the draft, I mean, it basically transcribes the negotiating directives into draft legal provisions. And what it says is that once this transition period, it will have to implement in full EU law, including new rules that would be agreed during the transition period. So, for instance, the mobility package, which contains rules that are going to revise driver's hours rules, or all the rules related to licensing, is likely to be agreed not before Brexit, I think, but possibly during the transition period, where this is something that the UK would have to implement in full. And obviously, the same thing in other sectors and other domains. There would be no voting rights or automatic representation for the UK. Any representation, any right to sit around the table or to be consulted would be at the sole discretion of the EU27 side during this transition period. And what it would mean for businesses is essentially that single market and customs union membership would continue, meaning pretty much the status quo from your point of view as far as UK-EU and EU-UK trade is concerned. And everything would be overseen by the European Court of Justice, meaning that any disputes, any divergence by the UK from EU rules would have to be resolved at that level. or indeed through another mechanism, and I'll talk about that in a second. Agreements with third countries, well, this is more of a difficult area, really, because basically the EU27 line is that the UK should be bound by the obligations stemming from these agreements, but there would be no certain access to benefits coming from these agreements. So to give you a couple of practical examples, if you take the trade deals with Korea or Canada, for instance, a Canadian or Korean company would be able to export to the UK under exactly the same terms as it does today. So in many cases, no tariffs. But the contrary would not be true. So a UK company exporting to Canada or to Korea might that they have to pay some tariffs. The UK may negotiate but not enact agreements, meaning that negotiations could take place during that time, but obviously none of the agreements could be signed or could enter into force unless that is the EU27 side agreed. So focusing on these two last points that I mentioned, which are likely to be the most, really the most problematic, one thing that really started a bit of a fight between the two sides was a decision from the European Commission to insert a footnote that drafts legal provisions for the transition, which basically said that because they felt that the usual procedure of infringement arbitrated by the European Court of Justice was a bit too slow, they could think of a new mechanism that would allow the EU to basically suspend certain benefits for the UK if the UK was found to be in breach of EU rules during the transition. So what it could mean is if the UK did not implement in full EU law, for instance, or did not perform its role in terms of collecting duties at the external frontiers of the EU, then the UK could get punished with restricted access to the market or somehow see some kind of restrictions or more costly alternatives. So although it wasn't fully defined, that footnote was just a couple of lines, this is something that triggered a big fight. And our understanding is that the EU27 member states are now thinking of using that only as a last minute, last resort alternative, rather. Obviously, there are still a number of issues for the international agreements. The UK government has issued a technical note on international agreements during the transition implementation period.
Yeah, I'd like to know about it. I'm listening to a lovely Brexit webinar.
I'm sorry, but I think someone is not on mute, so if you could just go on mute, please. Thank you. Anyway, sorry about that. Going back to the webinar, in terms of the international agreements note, as I said, the note focuses on the 750 plus international and bilateral agreements concluded by the EU on behalf of member states. And these could include trade or aviation agreements, for instance. And basically what it says is that the UK government's proposal is that all these agreements should continue to apply to the UK in the same way they do today during the duration of the transition implementation period, so that the UK may get access in full to their benefits. The note explains how this would be achieved from a technical point of view. But it is something that the EU, well, Michel Barnier in any case, has somehow rejected by stating that the UK would be bound by obligations stemming from these agreements during the transition period, but that the EU alone could not promise or ensure that the UK would also continue to reap the full benefits of these agreements, because all these agreements involve a third party, whether it's Korea, Canada, or any other country. They would also have to agree. So this is likely to be much more of a difficult issue as discussions continue. Why it matters because for importers and exporters, at this point in time, you don't have certainty of whether you would pay some tariff on your goods when you export to these countries, and what these would be. So this is a big point for us, and our priority is to ensure that these agreements will be to apply, that UK traders and transport companies may continue to benefit from them until the end of the transition period. This is a point that will be discussed further in the negotiations, obviously, and talking about other aspects of these agreements. There are two really that have been highlighted: the issue of citizens' rights, because the EU is very clear that they want the political agreement reached in December, to also cover citizens that would move to the UK during the transition period. So if, for instance, you wanted to employ an EU worker who was not yet in the UK but wanted to move after Brexit, but during the transition, the EU 27 side would like that person to have the same rights as citizens already in the UK, meaning the right to stay there and be employed, everything without any restrictions. The UK government does not agree with that. They're happy to continue with freedom of movement only during the transition, but then they want to restrict that on the day the transition ends, and only cover those citizens who were there before Brexit. And the other issue is the fact that the UK government wants to have an opt-out right from rules adopted during the transition period. So if any rules on road transport, on aviation, on anything were discussed and agreed, obviously without the UK being involved, and the UK found them to be particularly problematic, the government wants to retain the right not to implement these rules. This is something that the EU side is very much against, because they see it as a breach of the integrity of the single market. So they are going to obviously fight that quite strongly. So all of this, as you can see, there's still so many pending and open issues that this led Michel Barnier to say last week that essentially he has, and we have no guarantee that there will be a transition period. And if there is none, then the only scenario is that in March 2019, the UK leaves the EU, and then double WTO rules kick in. So what to expect and when? To sum up, I mean, the withdrawal agreement, which is just a political agreement at this point, indeed was agreed in December. This has to be translated into a treaty, a withdrawal treaty, that will contain some elements related to citizens' rights, the Irish border and so on, but also the transition, so very important. And this will be accompanied by a political statement or agreement with no legal value at this point on the framework for the future relationship. The transition or implementation period could then take place, if it's been approved, between March 2019 and, well, either December 2020, which is the EU's preferred option, or March 2021, which is the UK's preferred option. And then, hopefully, a new comprehensive UK-EU free trade agreement and all the related arrangements, for instance, for transport, would apply after that. Obviously, there is also the risk of a gap between the end of a transition period, if it's quite short, and the entry into force of new arrangements, in case negotiations are not finalized yet on everything. So in terms of planning, we can see two different scenarios. A very negative one, where somehow the discussions don't get to the point where everyone would like them to get. There is no deal, and a fairly brutal exit in March 2019, with all the consequences that we've talked about in previous webinars. Obviously delays and checks at the borders, for instance. This raises a lot of questions in terms of authorities' preparedness, as well as industries' preparedness, but also in terms of restrictions on transport. You have a positive scenario, which is the other alternative, which is obviously the rosy option of everything works out the way it's supposed to. The moment the UK leaves the EU, the transition kicks in, and then everything is agreed and implemented in time for the end of the transition. To be honest, the truth is probably in between these two scenarios.
Yeah.
So we're going to focus now more on the road transport arrangements, and I'm going to ask my colleague Sarah to tell you more about that.
Thank you, Pauline. I will now take you through a few points on the conditions under which lorries will be allowed to cross the borders post-Brexit, be it between the UK and the continent or between the UK and the Republic of Ireland. So these conditions will depend on the outcome of negotiations. What we know is that the default situation is that a community license issued by the UK would no longer be valid in the EU27 post-Brexit, as it is the case now. To address the situation, there are different options that have to be addressed in the negotiation.
Try and contact them.
What I'm going to do as well, just closing that, because that's the issue we've got.
Among the possible options, the first one, which you see on the slide, would be a liberalized system whereby all licenses issued by the UK would be recognized on the EU27 and vice versa. So in this situation, lorries would be allowed to cross the borders into Ireland or into mainland Europe freely and vice versa. This option is the closest to the status quo, and it would require a road transport agreement or a wider agreement between the UK and the EU. To give you an example, this is the situation in which Switzerland is now. It's an example of a model which is based on the land transport that was agreed between Switzerland and the EU. Another possible option would be a permit system with qualitative criteria, but no volume restrictions, which means there would be no quotas and a number of vehicles allowed to cross the border. This option would imply some administrative procedures, but it would preserve probably the ability to cope with the volume of goods. However, currently the EU is not equipped to deliver permits, as this is currently a prerogative of member states, and the necessary administrative infrastructure is not in place to deliver these permits. So a few question marks here, and this option 2, like the first one, requires an agreement between the UK and the EU. The third family of options would be a permit system with volume restrictions this time, so quotas, and this could be achieved in different ways. A first possible option would be a new bespoke system, which would be based on an agreement between the UK and the EU, or which could be based on bilateral agreements between the UK and the different EU member states. In this scenario, there are also some question marks regarding, for example, the different types of international transport. Such an agreement may not allow what we call cross-trade, for example. So a UK operator may be allowed to make point-to-point deliveries between the UK and another country, but may not be allowed to pick up goods, let's say in France, and deliver them in Germany. This would be up to the negotiation of this agreement, and it's, for the time being, an area of uncertainty. The second option under this family of options, namely a permit system with volume restrictions, would be something based on an existing system, which is called ECMT permits. And this one does not depend on the outcome of upcoming negotiations between the UK and the EU27. ECMT permits are already available. However, this system has very important limitations. So in spite of being available, we do not consider it a satisfactory solution, and I will explain why in a few minutes. So obviously, FT is pushing for the best possible outcome with as little administrative burden as possible and with no volume restrictions. And we understand that the UK government is also seeking the best possible solution with as little red tape as possible. However, there is an element of uncertainty with all options, but the one which doesn't depend on the negotiation, namely CMT permits. Therefore, as a contingency measure, the government is now taking the necessary preparatory steps to make a permit system work in case a more favorable agreement cannot be found. And this is what the road haulage bill is about. So the road haulage bill has been introduced on the 7th of February, and it gives the Department for Transport the powers to allocate permits in any scenario that would imply rationing, so in any scenario which would have quotas. The bill does not contain criteria that would be used to decide who to allocate the permits to. However, they will be defined at a later stage in secondary legislation. In all likelihood, the criteria will be designed to optimize the use of available permits. And I will now take you through the functioning of the CMT permits, and I'll explain why it is a contingency measure that we hope will never have to be used in practice. So ECMT is a system under OECD in which 43 European countries participate. What transport operations would be concerned by these permits? As I said, as of the date of Brexit, a community license issued by the competent authority of the UK will no longer be valid in the EU 27. Therefore, share and reward operations between the UK and EU 27 countries, including transit, would be subject to ECMT permits directions. In principle, own account operations should be exempt. However, 10 countries under the ECMT system have reservations on this point, among which France, including for transit, which means that, in effect, own account vehicles entering continental Europe via Calais would have to use a permit. And it's worth noting that cabotage is not permitted under ECMT, which is quite an important restriction. How many ECMT permits are available for the UK? The UK has a base limit of 100.
So, sorry, but whoever is not on mute, if you could go on mute, please, because others are trying to follow the webinar. Thank you very much.
So going back to the ECMT permits, the UK has a base limit of 102 annual permits, bearing in mind that the permit is allocated specifically to a company and can't be transferred to another company. Each permit can be used only by one vehicle at a time, but it can be used by different vehicles successively, as there is no mention of a registration number on a permit. On that basis, if the UK decides to allocate permits only to Euro 6 vehicles, there is something called a multiplier, and it means that the number of base permits will be multiplied by 12. So if it were allocated only to Euro 6 vehicles, the UK would have 1,224 permits. Restrictions in the number of permits would also apply to operators registered in the EU 27 going to the UK. And the same multiplier would also apply. But all in all, given these numbers, it means that ECMT permits would only cover less than 3% of transport needs. And that's the main reason why ECMT permits are not an acceptable outcome to cope with the transport volume we see. Briefly, how it works in practice. Permits would be valid for a calendar year and for an unlimited number of journeys, bearing in mind one permit in one vehicle at a time. Operators are restricted to 3 trips while abroad at a time, and the 4th trip should be the return journey to the country of registration, so to the UK in our case. Because the number of trips is restricted, hauliers must keep a record of their operations, and there's a logbook in which record must be kept. And this logbook must be kept in the vehicle at all times. It's also worth noting that there can be a fee. The UK is free to decide that there will be a fee to get a permit. And currently, in the very rare situations in which ECMT permits are used to go to non-EU countries, the fee is £133 per permit. So this gives you an idea of what it could be. Overall, our assessment of this system is that ECMT permits are not an appropriate solution to cope with the volumes of goods between the UK and the other countries of the EU27. It's also not an appropriate solution because it would be somewhat cumbersome with an application process, with criteria. So this is the reason why we think the road haulage bill, which introduces the necessary preparatory steps to make this system work, is a sensible contingency, but should never have to be used. So our main message here is that the UK and the EU27 negotiators should really find an agreement ensuring a restricted passage of lorries, which is key for our industry. Apart from giving the powers to allocate permits, the road haulage bill has a second aspect, namely it gives DFT the power to introduce and run a trailer registration scheme. Having a registration scheme for trailers is a prerequisite for the UK to ratify the 1968 Vienna Convention on Road Traffic. And this is what the UK is planning to do, because it sees merits in this convention. For example, it includes a recognition of driving licenses if certain conditions are met. It also says that participating countries must accept vehicles and trailers which comply with certain requirements in international transport in the territories of signatory countries. We understand that trailer registration will probably be mandatory for trailers used internationally between the UK and mainland Europe. And trailers used between the UK and Ireland will probably not be subject to this mandatory registration system. We also understand that commercial trailers with a maximum mass not exceeding 7.5 tons may be exempted from mandatory registration. And that for trailers used domestically only, there may be a voluntary registration scheme. So this is in a nutshell the two aspects covered by the road haulage bill, ECMT permits or ability for the DFT to allocate permits, and introducing a trailer registration scheme, which will be further defined in secondary legislation. Now I would like to address another topic, which might be an area of interest for you, namely the conditions and requirements applying to drivers and transport managers as individuals post-Brexit. This breaks down, I think, into two sets of questions. The first one, will EU nationals currently working in the UK have the right to stay post-Brexit? And it was addressed in the previous webinar in January, so I invite you to go to our website and listen to the recording if you're interested in this topic. And Pauline gave you additional information a few minutes ago on what could happen during the transition period regarding this question. But now I would like to focus on the second set of questions. Will qualifications and CPC issued by UK authorities be recognized in other European countries post-Brexit? So first of all, driving licenses. Currently, driving licenses issued in the UK are automatically recognized in the EU. And this will cease to be the case after Brexit. However, if the UK ratifies the Vienna Convention, there may be a safety net there because driving licenses would be recognized in other countries that ratify the convention, which are almost all EU 27 member states, but Spain and Ireland. And second important aspect, driver CPC. Well, currently a driver CPC issued by the UK is recognized in the EU. And if it's not explicitly foreseen in a road transport agreement or in land transport agreement, this will no longer be the case after Brexit. This is one more reason for FTA to campaign for such an agreement. And what I've just explained regarding driver CPC would also apply for transport manager CPC. And finally, another change, which may only affect a minority of you if you also have a haulage company registered in the EU 27, for example, in Ireland. If this transport company employs UK drivers, there will be some changes in the administrative requirements to operate in the EU. So in that case, an additional document will be required, which is a driver attestation issued by the authorities of the EU country concerned, so in our example, issued by Irish authorities, to confirm that the UK driver is employed in conformity with all relevant legislation. So this is a very short overview of the changes that could apply regarding qualifications and drivers post-Brexit, given the information we have now. Obviously, the negotiations will determine more precisely how the situation will be post-Brexit. And with that, I back the floor to Pauline.
Okay, so Sarah has taken us through some of the implications for road freight, and yes, well, the consequences don't look good if everything goes south, I'm afraid. So we're quite aware of the challenges and the risks, and of course, so is government, I'm sure, and we're working on making sure that it doesn't come to that. Until then, of course, and certainly until March 2019, I think it's important to remember that there are no changes. So essentially, the UK is still a member of the EU, of course, now. All the same rules, all the same penalties apply. You very much have to respect all the rules as you did before the referendum, of course. And that will be the case definitely until Brexit, potentially during any transition period that would be negotiated. So now is really the time to assess the impact of Brexit on your operations and to prepare contingency plans as well. So obviously, I've talked you through some of the risks, some of the things that are discussed in the negotiation. We've seen the implications for road freight as well as the implications right now. What are the things that we are pushing for? Based on the UK Council that took place a couple of weeks ago, we have identified 8 points that are things that industry really needs at this point in time. The first one is to get an urgent confirmation of the terms and the length of the transition. We all need to know, and we all need to be certain, legally certain, of what the transition will look like, what we can expect, if we have to change or prepare for any changes, and how long it's going to last. This is very important for companies. The second point is to ensure that frictionless trading arrangements can continue during the transition. We want the transition to preserve the status quo for companies so that you only have to adapt once to one set of change at the end of the transition period. We want continued access to the benefits of the EU agreements during the transition. What that means is that all the trade agreements, for instance, or aviation agreements that have been negotiated by the EU with third countries, obviously the UK would be bound by the obligations stemming from these agreements, as I explained earlier, if there was a transition. But there's no guarantee at this point that the UK will be able to also benefit from the advantages granted by these agreements. We want that to be solved as a matter of urgency. Another very important point, and that's really primarily for the UK government, we need urgent clarification regarding the UK's customs certification system so that you can start classifying your goods under the system. I mean, there are a lot of different categories for products that would tend to look fairly similar. So I think just for chicken alone, there might be up to 4 or 5 different categories. Obviously, this is not something that can be provided at the last minute, and a bit of clarity as to which system will have to be used would be very useful. It would also be essential to know what would the duty rates, if any, what would the VAT arrangements be as well. All of this, especially in the absence of an agreement, because in the absence of an agreement, there is no transition, and you need to adapt to all of this by the end of March 2019. Obviously difficult, if not impossible to do, unless we have clarity on this point. Another very important point is to get an agreement that obviously once the new arrangements start, so after the transition if there is one, conformity, sanitary and phytosanitary checks are done at the point of production rather than at the border. We don't want these checks taking place at the border, at ports, for instance, which would be the default situation in the absence of any agreement deciding that things are done in a different way. This is important in order to preserve the fluidity of the traffic. Likewise, and I think based on what Sarah has explained, we want to avoid any restrictions to the number of vehicles that are able to cross the borders between the UK and the EU. We don't want a system where there is a set of permits that potentially could be quite limited, where some companies will obtain permits 1 year and others will not. This is something, in our view, that needs to be avoided as a matter of priority, and we're really pushing strongly for that. So we're very happy that finally the EU27 side is going to look at this, we understand, next week as part of their internal workshop with the task force of Barnier. A key point is the continued recognition of vocational driving licenses as well as qualifications. Driver CPC, of course, is a good example, and Sarah has explained why. And obviously, we want continued access to logistics workers that are employed in the UK on a seasonal basis, because although the political agreement reached in December already covers quite a lot of EU workers currently present in the UK, it would not cover agency workers that might only be employed on a very temporary basis and that are not resident in the UK. So someone who's just coming to help you out with peak demand 2 or 3 months in the year, and who might live in another country during the rest of the year, would not be covered by the agreement. And we want to make sure that industry still has access to these drivers to cope with peak demand. With this, I want to leave you with a number of important events and milestones that we'll have in the coming weeks. Obviously, before I do that, I encourage you strongly to register to get the Brexit Digest. It's a weekly digest that we issue on a Monday. If you're interested in Brexit, this is quite a nice thing to have. Just drop me an email, and we'll be extremely happy to put you on the list. My email address is P for Pauline Bastidon, BASTIDON @fta.co.uk. In terms of key milestones, so 7th of March, we're doing a big event on Brexit in Brussels and the European Parliament, together with the Port of Dover and the Port of Calais. We're hoping that there will be quite a lot of industry representatives from the EU side, but also members of the European Parliament, as well as members of the task force of Michel Barnier, of Commission services, and representatives from other member states who are dealing with Brexit, with transport, and with customs issues in particular. If you're interested in that, also please drop me a line, and I will see what we can do. This is free. On the 15th of March, same time, you've got your next FTA Brexit webinar, and we're hoping to be able to report in more details on where things are going in terms of the transition, but also what the discussions look like for the future relationship. And on the 2nd of May, we'll have a NFT Brexit seminar at Multimodal. So if you're going to Multimodal, which will be next to Birmingham Airport, I encourage you to come and see that NFT Brexit seminar. So thank you very much for your attention. I don't see any questions at this point. So if you have any questions, happy to take them. If not, and if you think about your questions later in the call, I wish I'd asked that, no worries, drop me an email and we'll be happy to deal with that as well. So again, thank you very much for your attention. Please stay tuned with our Twitter account, Facebook account, and the Brexit section of the website. And if you want more of this more regularly, please subscribe to our weekly Brexit digest. Just an email to me is enough, and then you can be on the list. Thank you very much, and have a nice day.